The house was filled with coziness. Soft light filtered through the thick curtains, casting long, lazy shadows on the walls. The fire crackled in the fireplace, filling the living room with a sense of safety and warmth. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of vanilla, my favorite candle, which I lit in the evenings. Everything was as it should be, or at least it seemed that way. David sat in his chair as usual, but today there was something strange about his posture. His hands rested on the armrests, relaxed, but his fingers twitched slightly, betraying inner tension. He stared into the fire as if seeking answers in it. It was unsettling. David was always a man of logic, rational and calculating. He didn't believe in fate's signs or aimless musings, but now his gaze was fixed on the tongues of flame, and I knew his thoughts were far from ordinary concerns. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He slowly turned his head toward me. His gray eyes, usually calm and confident, now seemed strangely empty. There was no worry in that gaze, but something else. Something cold, almost calculating. I felt uneasy. "Yes," he said with a slight smile. "Just thinking." I placed my hand on the armrest of the sofa, trying to feel the familiar warmth of the moment, but something in the air had changed. "About what?" I asked cautiously. David leaned forward, interlocking his fingers. He looked as if he was about to say something important, something that could change everything. A sense of unease stirred in my chest, like a quiet alarm before a storm. "I want you to do something for me, Kat," he said softly, but with a tone that left me no choice. I felt a tightening inside. This was not just a conversation. This was a moment when reality began to crack at the seams. "What exactly?" I asked, choosing my words carefully. He took a deep breath, and the sound of it broke the silence that had hung between us. "I want you to spend the night with another man," he said, looking me straight in the eye. The air in the room seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and sticky. The words hung in the space like red-hot metal, ready to burn the skin. "Are you joking?" My voice was thin, almost childlike. I waited for him to laugh, to say it was a silly prank, but he didn't smile. "No, Kat, I'm serious. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I'm sure it will be good for us." "Good for us?" I looked at him, trying to find familiar features in this man with whom I had lived for 15 years. But before me sat someone else, cold, alien, with an idea that made the blood run cold. "Have you lost your mind?" I whispered. "David, what's wrong with you?" He nodded as if expecting such a reaction. "No, Kat, I'm not crazy. I just want us to try something new. I thought you might like it." "Like it?" I gasped for air. "You're suggesting I sleep with another man, and you think I should like it?" "Listen," he leaned back, his gaze softened but remained firm. "I'm not saying you have to agree right now. I'm just asking you to think about it." I shook my head. My heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out even the crackling of the firewood. "Who?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. He paused for a second, and then he said something that completely knocked me out of reality. "Henry, our black neighbor." I blinked. Once, twice, trying to understand if I had heard correctly. "Henry? You mean our neighbor?" My voice was so quiet I could barely hear it myself. "Yes," David nodded. "Henry, 65-year-old Henry?" I repeated, hoping he would realize how crazy it sounded. "Yes." I felt nauseous. Henry, our 65-year-old black neighbor, lived across the street. A widower, kind, a bit scatterbrained. We talked to him almost every day when we met at the mailboxes or in the store. I helped him around the house, sometimes brought him baked goods. But this was beyond all boundaries. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. Thoughts refused to connect into coherent sentences. "Why?" was all I could manage to say. David pondered, as if about to give me an honest answer. "Because he's lonely," he finally said. "And because you're beautiful, Kat. I think it could be good for both of you." I abruptly stood up. "You're sick," I whispered. "You're really sick." He didn't argue. He just looked at me. And then I realized he hadn't just suggested this to me. He had already decided. And at that moment, I felt truly scared. The doorbell rang so sharply that I jumped. Time seemed to slow down as I looked at the dark spot of the door peephole. David stood behind me, his breathing steady and calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment. I slowly opened the door. Henry stood on the threshold. He looked a bit confused, but there was something else in his eyes. Understanding, realization of what was happening. His wrinkled fingers clutched a hat, and his breath was slightly heavier than usual. "Good evening, Catherine," he said in a low, slightly hoarse voice. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Good evening," I managed to say, not knowing what to say next. David, remaining behind me, stepped forward, and his hand gently touched my shoulder. "Let him in, Cat," he said, and there was no doubt or hesitation in his voice. My fingers tightened on the doorknob. This was the moment when there was no more choice. There was only the way forward. Catherine felt the air in the room become thick, like syrup, impossible to escape. Henry entered, his movements cautious, almost uncertain. He looked at David, then at her. "Have a seat, Henry." David gestured to the sofa. His voice was calm, but there was something alien in it. Catherine crossed her arms, feeling an unpleasant chill run down her spine. She wanted to say something, protest, leave, but instead stood rooted to the spot. Henry sat down, his fingers clutching the hat even tighter. He swallowed. "Are you sure this is right?" he finally asked, glancing at Catherine. She froze. Her heart tightened into a hard knot, as if squeezed by an icy hand of fear. Inside her, two conflicting feelings clashed: the instinctive desire to run and the paralyzing realization of the inevitability of what was happening. Her palms were sweaty, her breath shallow as if she were underwater and couldn't surface. Henry, too, seemed to feel the tension. His gaze darted from Catherine to David, as if trying to decipher the hidden meaning of it all. David, on the other hand, looked relaxed, almost smug. He watched them both with an expression of subtle satisfaction, as if observing a scene he had carefully planned. "Everything will be fine, Cat," David said, leaning back in his chair. "You just need to trust the process." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Inside her, a storm raged, chaotically mixing shame, anger, fear, and something else, darker, that she was afraid to acknowledge in herself. Her gaze slid to Henry. The old man nervously swallowed, his hands clenched into fists. He, too, didn't know what to do. In this, there was a moment of sincerity. They were both pawns in David's game, but the realization did not bring Catherine relief. Instead, it intensified the helplessness she felt. Silence filled the room, stretching between them like a heavy, invisible wall. Henry struggled to look up, met Catherine's eyes, and finally whispered, "If you don't want this, I'll leave." His voice was hoarse, but there was genuine concern in it. And at that moment, Catherine realized that more than anything, she wanted someone, anyone, to take responsibility for her choice. But there was no choice. Catherine felt the air in the room become thick, like syrup, impossible to escape. Henry entered, his movements cautious, almost uncertain. He looked at David, then at her. "Have a seat, Henry." David gestured to the sofa. His voice was calm, but there was something alien in it. Catherine crossed her arms, feeling an unpleasant chill run down her spine. She wanted to say something, protest, leave, but instead stood rooted to the spot. Henry sat down, his fingers clutching the hat even tighter. He swallowed. "Are you sure this is right?" he finally asked, glancing at Catherine. She froze. Her heart tightened into a hard knot. The room was quiet, but the silence was uncomfortable, almost painful. Every breath was labored, as if the air had become denser. Catherine felt like a prisoner in her own home. Her gaze darted from David to Henry, but in neither of their eyes was there salvation. David, seemingly oblivious to the tension, poured wine into a glass and took a small sip. His movements were slow, measured, controlling. He enjoyed this situation, watching his wife break. "No one is forcing anyone," he said with a slight smile. "We're just talking." But it was a lie, and they all knew it. Catherine clenched her fists. Thoughts were jumbled. She wanted to scream, run, but something stopped her. Maybe fear. Maybe the realization that there was no turning back. Henry also looked uncertain. He sat on the edge of the sofa, as if ready to stand up and leave at any moment. But he didn't. "Cat," David said her name with a softness that was almost mocking. You trust me, right? She didn't answer. Henry is a lonely man, David continued, leaning back. He deserves warmth, human contact, and you always said you felt sorry for him. Catherine felt her breath catch. He was using her own words against her. He was setting a trap, and she was slowly falling into it. Henry looked at her, his face tense, but there was a shadow of hope in his eyes. Or was it something else? This is strange, he muttered, but David immediately interrupted. Strangeness is just a point of view. We all got used to living within boundaries we invented for ourselves. Isn't it interesting to step outside them? Catherine felt something inside her break. She looked at the door. Leave. Just stand up and leave. But her feet wouldn't move. David watched her closely. He saw her hesitation, her fear. He enjoyed it. Don't think too much, he said almost in a whisper. Just feel. Henry swallowed. He looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the right words. His fingers trembled slightly. Catherine gripped the armrests of the chair. She realized this moment was the point of no return. If she agreed, everything would change. Forever. But if she refused, David wouldn't give her a choice. After her consent, a strange, oppressive silence filled the room. Henry sat hunched over, his eyes darting across the floor, not daring to meet her gaze. David looked relaxed, almost satisfied, as if everything was going according to his carefully laid plan. Catherine felt her chest tighten with horror. Her body felt foreign, as if she were inside a shell that no longer belonged to her. David had said this would make them stronger, but what if it broke her forever? She slowly stood up, her legs trembling. Every movement was a struggle, as if the air around her had become thick and viscous. I need to use the bathroom, she managed to say, not knowing what to say next. David nodded, his eyes never leaving her. She knew that look. He didn't trust her. She walked down the hallway, her steps echoing in her mind. When she closed the door behind her, she let out a heavy sigh. She gripped the sink, looking at her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked indifferent. Who was she? How had she come to this? Meanwhile, in the living room, silence hung between David and Henry. Henry ran a hand over his face, then looked at David. Do you really want this? His voice was filled with doubt. David smirked. Do you? His tone was too relaxed, almost lazy. If you didn't, you wouldn't have come. Henry looked away. He knew there was some truth in that, but he was still tormented by doubt. He looked at the door to the hallway where Catherine had disappeared. He could feel her fear, her unease, but he stayed. Catherine turned on the water, trying to drown out the buzzing in her head. Should she run? Flee now? Run into the night? Forget everything? But where? To whom? She was alone. She looked at her reflection again, took a deep breath. She felt like she had already lost, that if she went out now, it would all be over. The line would be crossed. She could hear their voices from the living room, muffled like the echo of a distant nightmare. Henry was saying something quickly, his voice trembling, and David was responding calmly, measuredly. He knew he was in control. Catherine ran her hands over her face. Inside her, there was no strength, no anger, only emptiness. She slowly turned the doorknob. The buzzing in her head didn't stop, but her body moved on its own. Each step felt like a sentence. When she entered, Henry looked up at her. In his eyes, there was a mix of fear and pleading. He seemed to want to tell her, "You can stop this," but she knew she couldn't. David looked at her and smiled. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. At that moment, her world shattered completely. Catherine felt her breath become shallow, as if her lungs refused to work fully. The room was hot, but her body shivered. She looked at David, who seemed calm, too calm as if watching a carefully planned spectacle. Henry still sat on the sofa, tense, his hands clenched into fists. He looked like he wanted to say something but remained silent, giving her the choice. A choice? Did she have one? "Are you sure?" Henry asked, his voice low with a hint of regret. She nodded, or did her head nod on its own? She wasn't sure. David stood up, his movements measured, controlled, like a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted. He approached Catherine, placed a hand on her shoulder, and gave it a slight squeeze. "You're doing the right thing, Cat," he whispered, his breath hot on her skin. She didn't respond. She couldn't argue, couldn't protest anymore. Everything inside her was empty. Henry looked at her with pity, but he didn't move. The whole situation felt like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Time slowed down. David left the room, leaving them alone. Catherine felt the air around her thicken, as if the walls were closing in, trapping her in this space. Henry stood up. He was tall, imposing, his age giving him an air of uncertainty. But in his eyes she saw a struggle. He was just as uncomfortable as she was. "You don't have to," he began, but Catherine raised her hand, stopping him. "It's already decided," she whispered. Her voice held no life, no emotion. She didn't know if this resolve was real or just a defense mechanism allowing her to survive this moment. Henry nodded, and a flicker of pain crossed his eyes. When it was all over, Catherine sat in the dark room, her skin cold, her fingers trembling. She felt empty, as if someone had ripped her out of her own body, leaving only a shell. David entered, his face content, satisfied. He sat next to her, his hand sliding down her back. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice filled with false concern. She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. She was no longer the Catherine who had existed before. Henry left without a word. He didn't even look at her. The entire night would remain between them like a heavy burden that couldn't be lifted. Catherine stood up and went to the bathroom. She turned on the water and looked at her reflection. In the mirror was a stranger, a woman with empty eyes and slumped shoulders. She reached out to the glass, as if trying to touch her former self, but she no longer existed. Morning came without warning. Gray light slowly filtered through the blinds, filling the room with cold reality. Catherine lay in bed, her body still, as if petrified. The room was filled with a suffocating silence. Only deep within the house could faint sounds be heard. David was making coffee, humming to himself. He was content. Catherine struggled to sit up. The world around her seemed blurred, as if she no longer belonged to this space. She looked at her hands. Her fingers trembled. She didn't know how much time had passed since Henry left. She hadn't heard the door close behind him, but she knew he had left without a word, and that was the worst part. When she entered the kitchen, David was already sitting at the table. He greeted her with a warm smile, as if nothing had happened. "Good morning, Cat." His voice was light, almost caring. She didn't respond. She just walked to the coffee maker and poured herself a cup. Her hands were still cold. David watched her, tilting his head to the side. "You're so quiet," he noted, taking a sip. "Is everything okay?" Catherine looked up at him. What did he expect? For her to say, "Thank you"? To smile and say everything was wonderful? But she knew he knew. He enjoyed her silence. "I'm tired," was all she said. David nodded, satisfied. He reached out, touching her fingers, and that touch made her shudder. "This was important for us, Cat," he said. "You understand that, right?" She didn't respond. She just drank her coffee until it went cold. Catherine didn't know what made her leave the house. Her feet carried her down the street until she found herself at Henry's door. His car was in the driveway, but he didn't come out onto the porch. She didn't know what she wanted. Answers? Apologies? Or just to make sure he still existed? She knocked. Silence. Then heavy footsteps. The door opened a crack. Henry stood before her, looking older, tired. In his eyes was something she couldn't understand. Fear, guilt. "Catherine," his voice was hoarse. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. They just stood there, connected by something invisible, something neither of them could explain. "I'm sorry," he finally managed to say. Those words weren't enough. "Me too," she replied. She turned around and left, never knowing if he was a victim or an accomplice. By evening, Catherine realized the world had changed. Or maybe she had. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to David go about his evening routines, turning on the TV, pouring himself a glass of wine, pacing around the house as if nothing had happened. But something had. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was empty. She couldn't live like this. She slowly approached the dresser, opened the top drawer. In her hands was an old heavy object she hadn't touched in years. She looked at the door to the living room. He was in there, the one who had destroyed her. The question was, could she destroy him? Catherine stood in the darkness, her heart beating steadily like a metronome. In her hands she held an old heavy pistol that had once belonged to her father. She hadn't touched it in years, but now it felt strangely natural in her fingers. In the living room, the muffled sound of the news played. David sat in his chair sipping wine, relaxed, confident, satisfied with himself. He didn't suspect that this night would be the last in their marriage. Catherine took a deep breath. Inside her, there was no fear, no doubt. She stepped forward. "You never thanked me, Kat." David's voice was light, mocking, as if discussing something trivial. "Don't you feel liberated?" She stood in the doorway, her shadow cast on the floor. He slowly turned to her, his smile fading as he saw the expression on her face. "You don't understand anything." Her voice was steady, cold. "You thought you could break me. You thought I would accept this, that you had won." She took another step. The pistol was lowered, but its presence in her hand spoke volumes. "But you were wrong, David. You underestimated me." David slowly raised his hands, trying to maintain his composure. "Kat, let's not do anything stupid. Put that down. You're not the type to—" The click of the cocked hammer made him fall silent. "No, David, I am exactly the type," she whispered. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. A gunshot rang out. The room filled with the roar, and David fell back, knocking over the wineglass. Dark red liquid spread across the floor, mixing with crimson drops. Catherine didn't flinch. She looked down at him, watching as he gasped for breath, his eyes darting wildly, trying to comprehend what had just happened. She felt nothing. The house was filled with silence. Catherine slowly walked to the phone, dialed 911, and held the receiver to her ear. "I just shot my husband," she said calmly. "Send someone." She hung up the phone and looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at her was no longer a broken victim. She was free. When the police entered the house, Catherine stood by the window, looking out at the street. Her hands were relaxed. The pistol lay on the table next to a shattered glass. She didn't resist. There was nothing to regret. Everything that had happened was inevitable. "Are you okay, ma'am?" one of the officers asked, leading her to the door. Catherine nodded. She was more than okay. She was free.